HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Martin and Malcolm and America, A Dream or a Nightmare, 20th Anniversary Edition, by James H. Cone, read by Crisden. Preface to the 20th Anniversary Edition. I had no choice but to write Martin and Malcolm and America when I did. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were like two hot flames burning inside me that would not go out. They were burning when I sat down to write my first book, Black Theology and Black Power, 1969, in the wake of the fires burning in Newark and Detroit during July 1967. Malcolm represented the flame of blackness and black theology, and Martin the flame of faith in its Christian theological expression. In the 1960s, however, Malcolm and Martin, blackness and Christianity, were widely considered opposites. There was a war going on in black and white America between Martin and Malcolm. Everyone was forced to choose sides, but I could not. They were like my left and right hands, both necessary for the full expression of my humanity and for my struggle to find my voice in the black freedom movement. I needed both Martin and Malcolm to defend black humanity under assault by white supremacy in America, and I understood why they talked differently about Christianity and blackness, nonviolence and violence, love and hate. I tried to demonstrate that in my writings about black liberation theology. I thought about Martin and Malcolm as I developed the central themes: A Black Theology of Liberation, 1970, The Spirituals and the Blues, 1972, and God of the Oppressed, 1975. But their flames still burned hot within me. I continued to wrestle with both of them at a deeper level in order to understand more fully their political and cultural meaning. For nearly 10 years before writing this text, I immersed myself in their world, as they overshadowed nearly everything I thought, read, debated, and wrote. The Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush years of the 1980s and early 1990s clearly showed how much America needed Martin and Malcolm, especially in the light of the criminalization of black America expressed in the Willie Horton ad and the elevation of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. Rethinking Martin and Malcolm and America 20 years later, I realized that this book expresses what I wanted to say about these two great flames of freedom, and there is nothing to add or subtract. Are Martin and Malcolm still needed in the 21st century, this so-called post-racial age? Have we moved beyond the need to talk about blackness? Are we not just Americans, no longer defined by the color of our skin? Perhaps, but I would not bet on it. We need Martin and Malcolm today precisely because many people think we have moved beyond the need to talk about race. Nothing could be further from the truth. The rising dominance of conservative, right-wing religious and political discourse in our national life shows the enduring significance of race. The election of Barack Obama as the first black president has in many ways served to heighten racial awareness among white people, inciting some to defend their privilege, with many taking up the Tea Party's popular slogan, "Take Back America." White supremacy has not gone away. It lurks behind the persistent doubt that Obama is a real American, in the racial profiling/criminalization of young black males, in the stigmatizing of welfare and food stamp recipients, and in systematic efforts to disenfranchise black voters. It has merely changed its form of expression, making it difficult for some people to see it and to name it. In a persuasive analysis, Michelle Alexander calls it the new Jim Crow. It is different from the old Jim Crow, which was open and often legalized, defined by segregation and lynching. The new Jim Crow is less visible, but it accomplishes the same thing: the subordination of blacks and the elevation of whites. No one could name white supremacy like Martin and Malcolm. That is why we still need them. If we do not name white supremacy, we cannot destroy it. If we do not name it, we cannot get beyond it to what Martin called the beloved community, and Malcolm called freedom for all human beings. We still need both of them to remind us as Americans that we are fighting against injustice in all its forms and fighting for the liberation of all people. As Martin put it, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. James H. Cone, June 2012. Preface. This book is about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, their relationship to each other, and their meanings for America. The dream and nightmare images are used to focus their perspectives on America, and to reveal something about the audiences to whom and for whom they spoke. In memory, as in life, Martin King and Malcolm X are still highly controversial African-American leaders. More than 20 years after their assassinations, their names arouse passionate acceptance or rejection, and few people, black or white, have unbiased opinions about them. Thus, it is important for any interpreter to beware of misleading notions about them that are promoted by both their admirers and detractors. The best way to gain reliable knowledge about Martin and Malcolm is through a careful examination of the life and thought of each figure in relation to the other, and in the light of the two main resistance traditions in African American history and culture, integrationism and nationalism. In the introduction, the meaning of integrationism and nationalism for African American intellectual history is briefly described, and a plea is made to freedom-loving Americans to turn to Martin and Malcolm for resources in the struggle for justice. Chapters 1 and 2 analyze the social origins of Martin's dream and Malcolm's nightmare by examining the family contexts which shaped their perspectives on America. In chapters 3 and 4, I examine the first stage of their thinking on the dream and nightmare, from the beginning of their public ministries in the 1950s through 1963, Malcolm, and 1964, Martin. This was the period when their differences were most pronounced, especially regarding their understanding of freedom and the means by which it could be achieved. Martin and Malcolm were, respectively, Christian and Muslim ministers. Chapters 5 and 6 show how their views of America were influenced by their religious beliefs. Popular images of Martin and Malcolm seldom acknowledge their movement toward each other and their break with earlier deeply held convictions about America. Malcolm's chickens came home to roost in 1963 to 1965, Chapter 7. His heart-wrenching break with Elijah Muhammad, his spiritual father, initiated a new stage in his thinking. Malcolm began to acknowledge the value of Martin King's contribution to the Black freedom movement. He began to advocate hope, that is, the participation of African Americans in the American political process. Martin King's dream was shattered in 1965 to 1968, Chapter 8, as he observed the nightmare in America's cities and on the battlefields of Vietnam. He began to talk like Malcolm X. In Martin's and Malcolm's radical shifts in perspective, they came to appreciate each other's views about America. Martin and Malcolm illuminate the two roads to freedom that meet in the African Americans' search for identity in the land of their birth. These roads are traveled in Chapter 9. Martin and Malcolm were nothing but men, with all the strengths and weaknesses pertaining to their gender. Only as we consider their weaknesses, Chapter 10, can we really appreciate their strengths, Chapter 11. I hope that we have the imagination and the insight to appreciate their great legacies. God knows the African American community needs Martin and Malcolm. America needs them too. Together, Martin and Malcolm can help this nation to move closer to the goal of justice for all. A word should be said about the uses of the term Negro, African, Black, and Afro-American. Because Martin King used the term Negro when he referred to the African American community, I have frequently used it when articulating his views. Malcolm X despised the term Negro as a self-designation. He preferred African, Black, and Afro-American. These terms are employed to express his perspective. The listener is entitled to know the perspective which has shaped my interpretation of Martin and Malcolm and the audience to which this book is primarily directed. I am an African American theologian whose perspective on the Christian religion was shaped by Martin King and whose Black consciousness was defined by Malcolm X. In more than 20 years of writing and teaching Black liberation theology, I've been attempting to relate Malcolm X and Martin King to Christian living in America, seeking to show that justice and blackness are essential ingredients in the identity of the Christian faith for African Americans. This book is an examination of the meaning of justice and blackness in America in the context of the lives and thought of Martin King and Malcolm X. While it focuses on the African American struggle for justice and identity, I hope that other people will find something useful for their struggles as well. I do not expect all persons to agree with what Martin, Malcolm, and I say about justice and blackness in America. I only hope that they will recognize that our proclamations for and against America are in fact expressions of our love for humanity. Unless America recognizes the rights of human beings, its future is doomed. I write because I believe in human beings. We shall overcome. Introduction. America, a dream or a nightmare? I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. This is our hope. With this faith we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing." Martin Luther King, Jr. March on Washington, Washington, D.C., the 28th of August, 1963. No, I'm not an American. I'm one of the 22 million black people who are the victims of Americanism. One of the victims of democracy, nothing but disguised hypocrisy. So I'm not standing here speaking to you as an American, or a patriot, or a flag saluter, or a flag waver. No, not I. I'm speaking as a victim of this American system, and I see America through the eyes of the victim. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare. Malcolm X, Corey Methodist Church, Cleveland, Ohio, the 3rd of April, 1964. The Meeting of Malcolm and Martin. "Well, Malcolm, good to see you," Martin said. "Good to see you," Malcolm replied. After nearly 8 years of verbal sparring through the media, two great African-American leaders, Martin Luther King, Jr. and Malcolm X, finally met for the first and only time in Washington, D.C., the 26th of March, 1964. Both were attending the U.S. Senate's debate of the Civil Rights Bill. Initiated by Malcolm following Martin's press conference, the meeting was coincidental and brief. There was no time for substantive discussions between the two. They were photographed greeting each other warmly, smiling and shaking hands. The slim 6'3" Malcolm towered over the stocky 5'8" Martin. They walked together a few paces through the corridor, whispering to each other, as their followers and the media looked on with great interest. As they departed, Malcolm teasingly said, "Now you're going to get investigated." Although the media portrayed them as adversaries, Martin and Malcolm were actually fond of each other. There was no animosity between them. They saw each other as a fellow justice fighter, struggling against the same evil, racism, and for the same goal, freedom for African Americans. "I'm throwing myself into the heart of the civil rights struggle and will be in it from now on," Malcolm told James Booker of the Amsterdam News the day before he departed for the nation's capital. Recently expelled from the Black Muslim movement, he was trying to develop a new image of himself so he could join the mainstream of the civil rights movement. In Washington, Malcolm observed the debate from the Senate gallery and held impromptu press conferences during much of the day. He was pleased that the Senate voted against sending the bill to the Judiciary Committee and then voted to start debate on the bill in the full Senate. He told the media that the Senate should pass the House-passed bill exactly as it is, with no changes. But he predicted glumly, if passed, it will never be enforced. You can't legislate goodwill. That comes through education. In another section of the Senate gallery, Martin King was observing the same debate, Like Malcolm, he also held several press conferences and cheered the Senate's decision to take up the bill. But he expressed concern about the Southern filibuster, which threatened to weaken it. Martin told the media that a month of legitimate debate was acceptable, but he vowed that if the Senate is still talking about the bill after the first week of May, he would initiate a creative direct action program in Washington and throughout the country to dramatize the abuse of the legislative process. He did not rule out civil disobedience. At first, we would seek to persuade with our words and then with our deeds. Martin also promised that he would fight for more civil rights legislation the following year. We cannot stop till Negroes have absolute and complete freedom. The meeting of Martin and Malcolm has profound symbolic meaning for the Black freedom movement. It was more than a meeting of two prominent leaders in the African American community. It was a meeting of two great resistance traditions in African American history: integrationism and nationalism. Together, Martin, a Christian integrationist, and Malcolm, a Muslim nationalist, would have been a powerful force against racial injustice. When they were separated, their enemies were successful in pitting them against each other and thereby diluting the effectiveness of the Black freedom movement. Both Martin and Malcolm were acutely aware of the dangers of disunity among African Americans. They frequently spoke out against it and urged African Americans to forget their differences and to unite in a common struggle for justice and freedom. Why, then, did Martin and Malcolm not set an example by joining their forces together into a Black united front against racism? The answer to this question is found partly in the interrelationship of integrationism and nationalism in African American history. These two resistance traditions also provide the historical context for a deeper understanding of Martin's dream and Malcolm's nightmare. Integrationism and nationalism in African American intellectual history. No one stated the dilemma that slavery and segregation created for Africans in the United States as sharply and poignantly as W.E.B. Du Bois. In his classic statement of the problem, he spoke of it as a peculiar sensation, a double consciousness, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The two-ness that Du Bois was describing stemmed from being an African in America. Here, then, is the dilemma, he wrote in The Conservation of Races. What, after all, am I? Am I an American, or am I a Negro? Can I be both? Integrationist thinkers may be defined as those who answer yes to the question, can I be both? They believe it is possible to achieve justice in the United States and to create wholesome relations with the white community. This optimism has been based upon the American creed, the tradition of freedom and democracy as articulated in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and is supported, they believe, by the Jewish and Christian scriptures. The integrationist line of thought goes something like this. If whites really believe their political and religious documents, then they know that black people should not be enslaved and segregated, but rather integrated into the mainstream of the society. After all, blacks are Americans, having arrived even before the Pilgrims. They have worked the land, obeyed the laws, paid their taxes, and defended America in every war. They built the nation as much as white people did. Therefore, the integrationists argue, it is the task of African American leaders to prick the conscience of whites, showing the contradictions between their professed values and their actual treatment of blacks. Then whites will be embarrassed by their hypocrisy and will grant blacks the same freedom that they themselves enjoy. On the other hand, nationalist thinkers have rejected the American side of their identity and affirmed the African side, saying, no, we can't be both. They have contended that 244 years of slavery, followed by legal segregation, social degradation, political disenfranchisement, and economic exploitation, means that blacks will never be recognized as human beings in white society. America isn't for blacks. Blacks can't be for America. The nationalists argue that blacks don't belong with whites, that whites are killing blacks generation after generation. Blacks should, therefore, separate from America, either by returning to Africa or by going to some other place where they can create socio-political structures that are derived from their own history and culture. Integrationism and nationalism represent the two broad streams of black thought in response to the problem of slavery and segregation in America. Of course, no black thinker has been a pure integrationist or a pure nationalist, but rather all black intellectuals have represented aspects of each, with emphasis moving in one direction or the other, usually at different periods of their lives. What emphasis any black thinker made was usually determined by his or her perspective on America. That is, whether he or she believed that blacks would soon be included in the mainstream of American life on a par with whites. When blacks have been optimistic about America, believing that they could achieve full equality through moral suasion and legal argument, they have been integrationists and have minimized their nationalist tendencies. On the other hand, despair about America, believing that genuine equality is impossible because whites have no moral conscience or any intention to apply the laws fairly, has always been the seedbed of nationalism. To understand Martin King's and Malcolm X's perspectives on America and their relation to each other, it is important to see them in the light of these two different but interdependent streams of black thought. Integrationism before Martin King. Integrationists have had many able advocates since the founding of the Republic. Among them were the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, many prominent black preachers, and representatives of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, the National Urban League, and the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. Frederick Douglass was the outstanding advocate of integrationism during the 19th century. Born a slave, Douglass escaped from slavery and became an international figure with his powerful speeches and writings in defense of the full citizenship rights of blacks. For him, the existence of slavery was a staggering contradiction of the principles of the Constitution and the concept of humanity. Unlike the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who denied his allegiance to a constitution ratified by slaveholders, Douglass embraced it as an anti-slavery document, and then proceeded to quote it as supporting evidence for the abolition of slavery. The Constitution reads, "We the people," not "we the white people," Douglass proclaimed. And if Negroes are people, they are included in the benefits for which the Constitution of America was ordained and established. No one was as persuasive as Frederick Douglass in pointing out to whites the hypocrisy of extolling the principles of political freedom and of natural justice articulated in the Declaration of Independence while holding blacks as slaves. His well-known Independence Day speech in Rochester, New York, on the topic, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" was calculated to cut deeply into the conscience of whites who thought of themselves as civilized. "To the slave, your celebration is a sham," he proclaimed to a stunned white audience. "Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States." Douglass's scathing words did not mean that he had given up on America, and would accordingly seek separation from the land of his birth. He was offered an opportunity to stay in England, where he was given many honors, but he rejected the idea. Douglass believed that blacks could find justice in the United States and safely intertwine their future with that of the white majority. He was severely critical of blacks and whites who proposed the colonization of blacks in Africa or some other place. "It's all nonsense to talk about the removal of 8 million of the American people from their homes in America to Africa," he said. "The destiny of the colored Americans is the destiny of America. We shall never leave you. We are here. To imagine that we should ever be eradicated is absurd and ridiculous. We can be modified, changed, assimilated, but never extinguished. This is our country, and the question for the philosophers and statesmen of the land ought to be, what principles should dictate the policy of the nation toward us?" Although Douglass experienced many disappointments in his fight for justice, he never lost his love for America or his belief that blacks would soon achieve full freedom in the land of their birth. I expect to see the colored people of this country enjoying the same freedom as whites, he said in 1865. Voting at the same ballot box, going to the same schools, attending the same churches, traveling the same streetcars, in the same railroad cars, proud of the same country, fighting the same foe, and enjoying the same peace and all its advantages. Optimism about blacks achieving full citizenship rights in America has always been the hallmark of integrationism. This optimism has been based not only on the political ideals of America, but also upon its claim to be founded on Christian principles. Blacks have believed that the Christian faith requires that whites treat them as equals before God. No group articulated this point with more religious conviction and fervor than black preachers. According to black preachers, Christianity is a gospel of justice and love. Believers, therefore, must treat all people justly and lovingly, that is, as brothers and sisters. Why? Because God, the Creator of all, is no respecter of persons. Out of one blood God has created all people. On the cross, Jesus Christ died for all, whites and blacks alike. Our oneness in creation and redemption means that no Christian can condone slavery or segregation in the churches or the society. The integration of whites and blacks into one community, therefore, is the only option open for Christians. As early as 1787, Richard Allen, an ex-slave and a Methodist minister, led a group of blacks out of St. George Methodist Church in Philadelphia, and in 1816 he founded the African Methodist Episcopal, AME, Church. He did this because he and his followers refused to accept segregation in the Lord's house. A few years later, James Varick and other blacks in New York took similar action and organized the African Methodist Episcopal Zion, AMEZ, Church. Black Baptists also formed separate congregations. Independent black churches were not separatist in the strict sense. They were not separating themselves from whites because they held a different doctrinal view of Christianity. Without exception, blacks used the same articles of faith and polity for their churches as the white denominations from which they separated. Separation for blacks meant that they were rejecting the ethical behavior of whites. They were rejecting racism that was based on the assumption that God created blacks inferior to whites. Blacks also wanted to prove that they had the capability to organize and to operate a denomination just like whites. In short, black Christians were bearing witness to their humanity, which they believed God created equal to that of whites. The motto of the AME Church reflected that conviction: God our Father, Christ our Redeemer, man our brother. When these sentiments are universal in theory and practice, the AME bishops said in 1896, then the mission of the distinctive colored organization will cease. Not all black Christians chose the strategy of separation. Instead, some decided to stay in white denominations and use them as platforms from which to prick the conscience of whites regarding the demands of the gospel and to encourage blacks to strike a blow for freedom. Liberty is a spirit sent out from God, proclaimed Henry Highland Garnet, a Presbyterian minister, and, like its great author, is no respecter of persons. Following the Civil War, the great majority of black Christians joined black-led churches among the Methodists and Baptists. The independence of these churches enabled their pastors to become prominent leaders in the black struggle for integration in the society. Prominent Baptists included Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and Jr. of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, New York, Martin Luther King Sr. of Ebenezer Baptist Church, Atlanta, William Holmes Borders of the Wheat Street Baptist Church, Atlanta, and Vernon Johns of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Montgomery. Rev. D.C. Ransom, an AME minister, was a pioneer black social gospeler. Other significant voices included Benjamin E. Mays, president of Morehouse College, and Howard Thurman, dean of Rankin Chapel and professor of theology at Howard University. All spoke out against segregation and racism in the white churches and the society, insisting that the integration of blacks and whites into one community was the demand of the Christian faith. In his book, Marching Blacks, Adam Powell Jr. accused white churches of turning Christianity into churchianity, thereby distorting its essential message of equality and brotherhood. No one can say that Christianity has failed, he said. It has never been tried. How can whites claim to be Christians and still hold blacks as...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?